My name is Jared Margulies, and I'm an assistant professor of geography here at UA, and I'm one of the faculty affiliates here at CONSERVE. I identify my work with the field of political ecology, which is a field interested in issues like environmental inequalities, the production of inequalities through the environment, access to resources and contests over those resources. And as a result of that, a lot of my work is really deeply participatory and community focused, and most of my work is about conservation. So for me, CONSERVE was sort of the ideal fit of a research group to be affiliated with here at UA. For me, the idea of CONSERVE is to create a really interdisciplinary hub on campus with an emphasis on community-centered and especially Indigenous-centered research. I've done work on multiple continents. A lot of my work has been in India, but also in other parts of the world. And all of that work is ultimately about how people manage their access to and gain access to forms of natural resources and issues in environmental conservation. And those kinds of questions and answers have to be community driven or the solutions won't be effective. So if we're only coming up with solutions to conservation problems by sitting around talking amongst ourselves as policymakers or academics, we're not going to come up with anything that's actually practically operational on the ground. And so working with communities is a really important part of what I do. Increasingly, I do a lot of work that is more participatory-led and also framed through what a lot of people call participatory action research. So a lot of that is about designing research literally from the ground up with people impacted by various forms of either environmental resource constraints or conservation problems. And so rather than sort of theorizing in my office thinking about, oh, what's my hypothesis, what's my research question, that work starts on the ground by engaging with people to find out from their perspective, what are the main issues that we kind of need to be addressing. And so a lot of my work methodologically is engaged with those kinds of community-led practices and around environmental resource management. And so I think that'll be a kind of key part of what I try to contribute to the community here. My job is extremely people-oriented. I'm ultimately extremely interested in environmental conservation. A lot of my work focuses on issues of wildlife trade and forms of illegal wildlife trade as well. So I touch on topics of criminality and illicitness too. But all of that is to say that at the end of the day, conservation is an inherently social problem and conservation also is only going to find solutions in dealing with the social. And so trying to approach the questions of environmental resources only from the perspective of, say, biology or engineering is going to completely miss the mark if we don't also engage really interdisciplinarily with social scientists. And I'm a social scientist, so that's good. For a long time, science was being done in these really top-down ways that didn't recognize how important it is to engage from the outset with people and communities broadly conceived as a concept. In framing research questions and research problems and how to go about answering those research questions. So really bringing in people from jump in doing that kind of research. And I think we have really good evidence to show that when you don't do that, projects fail. And so we can do a lot of really good science, but it won't matter if people feel like they have a sense of ownership over that work, or they don't feel like their needs or their claims are being, they can't see their claims or their needs being recognized in that science. And so science making needs to become more collaborative and more interdisciplinary, and that at the end of the day involves people. So as a political ecologist, I am very interested in issues of power in the environment. And so while it is easy for me to say that, yes, people should always be, industries, for instance, would always benefit from having people invested or involved from the outset, there are going to be moments of conflict where maybe the needs of industry aren't the same as those of communities or impacted by those industries. That being said, I think that a lot of different kinds of groups, whether those are industries or commercial or educational, have recognized that if you don't understand what communities need, you're not going to be able to come up with, viable solutions to the problems that they face. Issues over water in a changing climate are going to be more and more important every day. And we see that here in Alabama, we see it regionally, whether it's issues of suddenly too much water when we don't need it and not enough water when we do. And so community-centered approach to that kind of research is absolutely vital to understand what communities need and what kind of research needs to be done to address problems that they have. So this question of how to get communities involved in research is really important to me. It is a kind of science that does not happen overnight, and I think a lot of people who don't come from a social science background are suddenly surprised by how hard it is to work with communities when they're not used to doing so. It takes a long time to build trust in relationships that are meaningful and not extractive, and that's really important to me. Too often, research communities sort of parachute into places where they don't have good community relations or cultural ties or cultural relations, and that can lead to a lot of harm. And so it's going to be really important as part of the CONSERVE project that we think really sensitively about how we're developing relationships with communities that we want to work with and ultimately serve. A long time ago, I did a master's degree in biodiversity conservation and management, and it was becoming increasingly clear to me that solving some of these kind of most vexing and wicked problems of conservation and environmental change ultimately had to do with how do you engage with people and their needs, and making sure that people's needs are being met, not at the expense of, say, conservation with a big C. So too often I was seeing, especially in the global south, rural and oftentimes marginalized or racialized communities being disenfranchised by the work of conservation, and that doesn't lead to positive, sustainable conservation outcomes in the long term. And so it became extremely important and eye-opening for me to recognize that if you wanted to do meaningful conservation work, it was going to have to start looking very, very differently than how I was seeing it happen in many places in the world. And the good news about that is we have more and more good evidence that shows that when you meaningfully and thoughtfully engage with communities in developing research and policy and implementation plans that serve their needs while also serving the needs of, say, we're conserving some sort of resource, you can actually get things done, I think. And that's, obviously that's the goal, where, communities feel like they're being heard and, the resources that people rely on are also being preserved for the future. I'm really excited about CONSERVE. I think that for me what it represents is a really unique and ambitious goal of creating a meaningfully interdisciplinary or even ideally transdisciplinary research space on campus that really from the outset is thinking about how can we as academics within a robust research institution serve the communities that we're engaged with and bring them into the conversation. So that, these classic issues of the ivory tower don't keep getting reproduced in research on conservation. So for me, what's exciting about this above all is suddenly I'm meeting faculty from all over the campus that are in different fields, whether it's archaeology or botany or engineering, that I might not have otherwise encountered in my day-to-day work as a geographer. And that is creating a space where we can ask each other really interesting questions and I think do better science, and that's important. Increasingly, people who maybe weren't always paying attention to issues of environmental change or climate change are kind of waking up to realizing that we're living in a pretty dramatically changing world. And I think that learning to adapt and build resilience in the face of these kind of interlinked crises of the environment is going to really demand interdisciplinary approaches in community engaged research. So that's, for me, what I'm excited about. For all of those reasons, I would say I am CONSERVE.